Hello and welcome back to the Stacey West and to another preview. This time looking ahead to Bristol Rovers at home on Saturday. And let's be honest, I think we're all rather enjoying the games at the minute, so we're wanting them to come thick and fast, and they certainly are. Someone who I don't think is enjoying wanting to face Lincoln quite so much is Matt Iles. He's joining me today. Matt is a Bristol Rovers fan and is also one of the brilliant podcast hosts on the Real EFL's League One podcast, some of you may listen to, and also a commentator on ITV's Football League highlight show on a Saturday night. So you may have heard his voice before. How are we doing, Matt?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. Quite the introduction. So yeah, no pressure to try and talk about Rovers as much as I can. But yeah, really happy to have sort of been given the chance to talk about Rovers, really, which, to be fair, I don't really want to do at the moment, but there we go. So, such as we go on here.
I was going to say it's funny because the last time we did the Real EFL League One podcast together, you specifically gave me Bristol Rovers to talk about because you didn't really want to talk about them. So I guess like that, I guess we kind of use that as a bit of a starting point. The season as a whole we'll talk about in a second, but currently, what's your current situation? The form coming into this? What's the state of the club at this minute?
Well, I think you start with on the pitch. I think the best way to sort of describe Rovers has been quite consistently inconsistent, I think. I mean, we drew Tuesday with Fleetwood. I think it was our first league draw since December. And in all competitions, our first draw since the start of January in the FA Cup to Norwich. So we've had a bit of an up and down run. We've had a run where we've won 2 in a row, and then we seemingly lose 2 or 3 in a row. We've not yet had the pleasure of winning 3 games in a row this season, so it kind of probably tells you that the inconsistency mark is there. I mean, on the pitch has been, just a little bit, I'll say this briefly before you touch on the season. It's been quite a strange sort of season. I think the period at the moment, we've seen the best of Rovers under Taylor to some degree. Since he's come, we've seen the worst of the team under him, to be fair. So, yeah, it's been a little bit strange to form. I think, obviously, we've picked up wins sort of against Portsmouth, Bolton and Oxford and Stevenage, teams above us in the table. But then we've lost to sides like Burton, Fleetwood and Exeter at home, which simply isn't good enough and not scored. So, on one hand, you could say that we're 11th because we've beaten some of the top sides, but how we're 11th to some degree is because we've lost to those sort of sides below us. So, yeah, the form is a little bit sketchy coming into it, that's for sure. And knowing that Lincoln hit 6 in their last game against Cambridge, I think is one that makes you think. Hopefully, they've had all their goals out of them from that last game, and hopefully they don't bring any more into this one.
Well, don't forget the 5 on Saturday to Barnsley as well. So we certainly are in.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. Well, obviously you've mentioned kind of in passing there parts of the season. Let's go back to early on in the season. Now, 2nd of September to be exact, was obviously the 1-1 draw in the reverse fixture when you guys scored very late on. That was a very long journey back from Bristol that day, I'll tell you that one, after you guys scored so late on. But I want to pick up on one thing in particular. Your manager at that point, obviously Joey Barton. Obviously for us, it was also Mark Kennedy. Let's just take the off-the-field stuff that isn't to do with Bristol Rovers. I'm talking
of course,
some of his comments about kind of females in football, that sort of thing. Let's just take them out of the equation for a minute. First of all, purely on the pitch, were you guys happy with Joey Barton as a manager in terms of play style? Or are you now kind of pleased that he's no longer at the club? And then second of all, did he really do much damage in terms of his mouth, if you like, for Bristol Rovers as a football club whilst he was manager?
In terms of the first question, I think, ultimately, I think Rovers fans quite quickly did grow a little bit tired of the style of play. I think, there was a sort of a stubbornness from him not to really change. I think the sort of last few games of his tenure, I think you could see the early signs, and obviously it proved to be the sort of big signs that it ultimately looked like all didn't seem as well as what it was expected to be. I think, you know, he came in, and to be fair, we went down with an absolute whimper when he sort of first arrived in through the door, just sort of giving a bit of background, then had that amazing end to the League Two campaign, where obviously, you know, a lot of people still to this day probably certainly have their sort of theories if it was, you know, brilliant or if it was just sort of, you know, a little bit sort of hard against Northampton. But I think given the expectation this season, you know, we weren't expected to be the top six, of course. I think we knew, the Rovers fans, that there was a lot better sides in the division. So we expected to be at least challenging, kind of be consistently where we were or where we sort of are now, maybe a little bit more closer to the playoffs, but that's not really sort of talking about the job Taylor sort of done since sort of December or late November. But looking at Barton, I think, as I said, the style of play in the end really grew the fans tired, I think. So there was a point where we liked it. I think he certainly changed a lot of the landscape of watching football as a Rovers fan, because a lot of the football had been quite turgid and quite, you know, the standards had dropped, I think, particularly when we went down. But he did drive that back up, and he did bring in some decent players. And I think he, you know, tried to make the club more professional. So he left, I think, some sort of legacy on that front. But yeah, as I said, I think it grew a little bit tiresome. And kind of going on to your second point, I think his mouth as well did play a bit of a part in his downfall. I think, you know, there would be some, you know, ridiculous sort of things he would say in his interviews. Some of them were quite comical, whether they were justified or not. I think there was certainly a moment where he was very critical of managers, where, you know, in particular, he was very uncomplimentary to sort of Steve Evans. Now, say what you want about Steve Evans as a person in football, but I think being quite personal and saying about his, you know, saying about how quite big he is, I think is quite close to the bone, and quite a bad move, I think, to do. And obviously you hear a lot of stuff where, you know, he in the media, he'd run his mouth off about certain people and that. And I think it just shows a lack of respect. I think that was one thing that did ultimately lead to his demise as well. So, yeah, I think in the end, I think certainly after that Lincoln game, there wasn't really many more high points. I think the only one he really got was probably the Wigan home game where we won 4-1. And then after that, it kind of all just fell apart. But the club acted quickly, something they don't usually do, and saw the signs and thought it was probably going to get worse, which I think it was. And ultimately, it was quite a big surprise when they actually did announce the news sort of the end of October that he was obviously given the boot.
Well, obviously, there must have been a bit of a hope that after that point you will have very much picked up. But in terms of picking up from after that point, you know, as you've said, it's the inconsistency that very much kind of seems to have hurt you. And that's something that, again, on the Real EFL podcast, I think it was something that we spoke about a couple of weeks ago, where I kind of said from the outside looking in, it really does seem like it's the inconsistency that's costing you. What's the reason behind that? Is it a general lack of quality in squad depth? Is it sort of the tactical style that you're playing can only really suit a certain team or a certain opposition? Is it just simply a mental kind of aspect of you're just not really seeming to get a run together? What is it?
I think it's a bit of everything, really. I think the squad's there. I think it's a very sort of decent squad. I think, you know, it is a squad that or a starting 11, if you probably played the strongest side, that you'd probably say, yeah, it probably does maybe justify on paper being 11th. Of course, everybody knows you don't earn your place in the league on paper. I think the squad is certainly there. I think the group itself, you know, I think sort of particularly in sort of the performances you've had under Taylor, where we do seem to thrive when the bigger teams sort of come to the Mem or we go away to these away grounds. I mean, you know, that'll prove that up, as I said, with wins against Bolton away, Portsmouth at home, Orient away, or Stevenage away. And that's ultimately proved that. So I think the players quite like the idea of teams maybe being a bit more open and almost expecting them to come on to us. Whereas when we've played sides like Burton to some extent and maybe Exeter, they've had that sort of rigid formation a little bit. You know, Exeter scored early and managed the game really well. We were really poor on the night. Fleetwood's a bit of an exception because they ultimately wanted to play football and tried to pop the ball around. But there is just that element of when we have to try and break teams down, we're not quite good at it. But when teams open up, I think we kind of thrive off it. We almost think we could play our real game. We express ourselves a little bit more. And I think the shackles kind of come off. So I think it is a team that is designed at the moment for the big games when it's naturally kind of just happened and it's just sort of stemmed as the season's kind of gone on. So there's a little bit of that. I think maybe a mental side of things perhaps on the run, but it's difficult to really put a standpoint on it, but it must be a mental block when you know there's been opportunities to try and win 3 games in a row, but ultimately they've just slipped up and not been able to do that. So, yeah, I think there's a little bit of everything in that question that you asked there, Charlie.
Yeah, it's weird. I at one point, in fact, a couple of points, I kind of made the comparison between your guys' season this season and Lincoln's last season under Mark Kennedy, where especially kind of the second half of the season, you can get a little bit of a run together. And okay, yes, back then for us, it was more draws that were kind of holding us back. It isn't necessarily that for you. Maybe it's a few more losses than it is draws, but it's just not really able to get a run together, kind of floating in around that mid-table position. And, you know, and that's kind of where you expect to be at the end of the season, probably where you'd have expected at the start of the season. So it's sort of very much kind of, I think there's a good few comparisons in there. What I did want to ask is, and I'm gonna ask this now to everybody who we have on for a preview between now and the end of the season. And it's a very loaded question, really. It's a very simple question because I guess it's technically a yes or no, but it's actually a much more loaded question. From the outside looking in, can Lincoln make the playoffs?
I think obviously we were talking a little bit sort of before we were recording. I think now there's probably a possibility. I think this stage of the season, when you're into the crunch, the business end of it, if you can generate that momentum, you can build on anything. You can ride that crest of a wave to get to exactly where you want to be. And we've seen teams in the EFL, not just in League One, manage to sort of do that. We saw sort of, you know, there was a point with Stockport last year, certainly in League Two, where they really struggled first half of the season. They just completely exploded up, didn't they? And, you know, ultimately missed out on automatic separation on the final day and lost at Wembley. So it did fall short for them, but it can lead to something. I think there's a chance. I really do. I think we've obviously discussed League One quite a lot, Charlie, obviously. And I think if Blackpool sorted their away format, I think they'd be in contention. But we're not talking about Blackpool. Obviously, we're talking about Lincoln. But the performances are certainly there at the moment, it feels like. I think the results are certainly backing up, and they're making people now stand up. You know, we get 11 goals against Barnsley and Cambridge put together. And the most impressive thing is to win away at Barnsley and to score 5. I think he's proving it. I think at the moment, you've probably got the form player in the league in Jack Moylan. I mean, how many of the 11 goals is he contributing in terms of goals or assists? I mean, you'll probably tell me that in a minute. But yeah, I think that they are that team at the moment. Everyone's starting to look around that and think, they might have a chance of maybe making it. And, you know, obviously, in terms of what your running looks like, I think off the top of my head, I think it probably looks slightly more favourable than what it perhaps maybe does to some other sides. So I don't see how there's not a possibility. And I think, you know, of course, you talk about things in the here and the now. Before this game on Saturday, I think you look at Lincoln, and even though they are a couple of points below Stevenage, and maybe Stevenage have got one more game in hand, you maybe look to back Lincoln more than you would Stevenage at this moment in time.
Well, there you go. Back Lincoln. That's a pretty emphatic answer there. But no, I mean, obviously, I do agree. But it's nice to kind of hear it from someone from outside of the fan base that is sort of very complimentary. It's things we're starting to hear a lot more, especially after these 2 results back to back. Now, looking ahead again then to Saturday. 2 questions then. First of all, how are we kind of expecting you to line up in terms of formation, shape? And then on that, how do you kind of see the game going?
Well, I mean, obviously, Matt Taylor has been quite fond in previous incarnations at Exeter and Rotherham of playing a 3 at the back. He's obviously tried it with Rovers, and seemingly we're probably a little bit more open than what we should be with a back 3. I think you expect to be very solid if you've, you know, we could talk all day about tactics and stuff, but I think with a back 3, you shouldn't be conceding as much as we did. So he's ultimately, I think we had a real bad run of form where we'd had a bit of a sticky patch in January and February, and he ultimately has now gone to 4 at the back, which I think does suit us a little bit better. I think the balance of the team just feels a lot better. I think the players understand their roles a little bit more, and it feels like, you know, whilst I'm up for, of course, the modern day is now about developing players, and, you know, I think maybe time is on Taylor's side to do that, and I think he could have still done that. I think he's ultimately realised we just need to get the confidence back in the team. And we've had a few bad results. Let's just get them into sort of some of their normal positions. So at the moment, we're kind of operating in sort of a 4-2-3-1 system where ultimately you've got Camille Conte and sort of Sam Finley as the 2 older midfielders. I think Anthony Evans will sort of play just in front, who for me, I think is the key standout player for Rovers. I think he's someone who, in terms of his numbers, is having a really good season for Rovers. I think he's someone as well outside the top 6. It might sound a bit of a strong statement. I think he is probably one of the better players in League One, but a lot of people could arguably be thrown up in that conversation. So, of course, it's up for debate. You'd probably have, I think he started Harvey Vale and Sinclair as the wingers on Tuesday. Sinclair's starting to get a run in the side. He seems to like Harvey Vale on that right, so he can cut in on his left foot. And ultimately, you know, Chris Martin's obviously going to start up front if he's not injured. So you can sense that will be the team sort of going forward. I don't think there'll be too many changes unless there's an injury that happens between now and this game on Saturday. Usually, I think the back four, I think Jack Hunt's still unavailable, so it'll probably be Luca Hall, Elkin Baggett, Connor Taylor, and possibly Lewis Gordon. Then obviously Jed Ward in goal, who's come in instead of Matt Cox. And, you know, there's nothing better, and certainly you can attest this, Charlie, with, you know, someone who's come from the sort of, you know, a player's come from the Lincoln Academy, that, you know, there's always something really special that fans can love about a homegrown player. And, you know, that's kind of been it with Jed Ward. But in terms of your question, I think that's the way we'll sort of operate. And in terms of Saturday, I think we got a clean sheet away to Fleetwood. It was a draw. It was 0-0, which, you know, ultimately wasn't the best of results, but we didn't lose the game. And I think it was probably the right result. If you could sort of see the statistics and the highlights and stuff like that. I think what Rovers will want to do, but it's a different thing entirely, is I think they'll want to try and frustrate Lincoln. I think they know that they're in really good form. They know that they're in a massive ascendancy at the moment. The momentum's all with them. And they know that, you know, they're going to try and keep it 0-0 as long as they can. And that's something I think there's been missing from Rovers a lot this season. When we've tried to hold on, the last few times we've done it, where we've won 1-0 at Orient and Exeter, we had a lot of chances come to our goal. And I do think with the way that Lincoln at the moment, it seems everything they hit is going in, and luck on that side of things is there, whilst, of course, you're playing really, really good stuff. That's the only problem. And I think if Rovers try and set their stall up to be defensive, I don't think it's going to work, because with this team at the moment, if I'm being truthfully honest, I don't think they're capable of doing it. So I think they've got to try and find that way of knowing they've got to be solid, but don't completely take away their attacking integrity, because it almost feels like with Rovers fans, certainly I can say this, maybe some others can as well, you accept that we're going to concede, but you probably accept we're going to score. So it's quite a weird dynamic in that sort of sense.
Well, hopefully we can stop you from scoring, considering you look at our defensive record, obviously, just to kind of make you feel even more scared. What was it, 4 goals conceded in our last 12? You know, it's our defensive record is pretty solid. But on that, then, you say you may score, but may concede. I doubt it, but hopefully that is the case. What are you going to go for as your score prediction?
Well, I think, look, I always say things as honest as I can be. I'm not going to come here and sing from the heavens and say that Rovers are going to win the game, because I generally don't think we probably will. But I do think we'll make it a very good contest. I think that we do, as I said, tend to raise our game against the bigger sides. But then you're probably looking and go, well, look at Derby last weekend, which is sort of an example. So that's probably fair enough to get labelled. I think ultimately, I think Rovers will fall short. I'll be honest. You probably don't get many people predicting Lincoln wins when you're doing opposition previews, but I think it'll probably be a 2-1, 3-1 Lincoln. I think Rovers just, as I said, will try and be defensive, but there's just not enough in there at the moment to do it. And I think with that, the way the team is, it's inclined to maybe fancy going forward a bit more than defence. So I would say probably a 2-1, 3-1 in Lincoln's favour. So yeah, I'll probably get asked more on this podcast a bit more now if Lincoln do win this game.
Well, I'm definitely happy with that as a prediction. And do you know what? I have a feeling that might be the first Lincoln win prediction that we've had from an opposition fan. I believe so. I mean, it won't be the last with the way that we're playing at the minute and some of the teams we're facing. I bet some of them are going to be a little bit more sort of worried. I mean, when we play Carlisle, for example, on Easter Monday, and I have Ivan on this podcast, I guarantee that he won't be too bullish about Carlisle's chances either. So, like I say, I'm sure you won't be the last. But no, I am going to join you, obviously, with the Lincoln victory. I just think we can keep that clean sheet. I'm going to go 2-0. I think it might just be that slightly tougher game. I mean, I was expecting that against Cambridge and Barnsley and Shrewsbury. So, you know... But I am going to go 2-0. I think we can just edge it, keep the clean sheet, attack well, and get through then until, what was it then? The Easter weekend, which will be the next game after this one, because we've got the international break. So yeah, very much looking forward to that. Thank you so much for joining me, Matt. Everybody make sure to go and check out, all of Matt's socials. Listen onto the Real EFL's podcast on Sunday. Well, it'll be released on Monday. That will have Matt as host, and it'll actually have myself on it as well this weekend. So
Lovely.
Looking forward to that one, especially if Lincoln win. I did say off camera, if Lincoln lose, I'm pulling out. I'm pulling a sickie, telling Matt I can't do it. So be sure to check all of those things out. Thank you so much for joining me, Matt. Good luck for the rest of the season. And up the ups.